The crystal tumbler trembled in Nikki Newman's hand, the ice clinking a nervous rhythm against the glass. She stood by the fireplace in the main salon of the Newman ranch, the warmth of the flames doing little to chase away the sudden chill that had settled in her bones. Across the room, the shadow of a man she hadn't seen in 30 years stretched long and menacingly over the Persian rug. Desmond Shaw. The name tasted like ash. He hadn't changed much, still the same slicked back hair, though now silver instead of jet black, and the same predatory glint in his eyes that she remembered from the neon-soaked nights of Las Vegas. He sat comfortably on Victor's leather sofa, looking as if he owned the place, a stark contrast to the rough and tumble hustler she had known when she was just a desperate girl trying to survive. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Nikki," Desmond said, his voice a low, gravelly purr that made her skin crawl. "Or should I say, Nicole, that was the name on the fake ID back then, wasn't it?" "Get out," Nikki hissed, though her voice lacked its usual imperious fire. She glanced toward the hallway, terrified that Victor or one of the staff would walk in. "If my husband finds you here." "Victor," Desmond chuckled, picking a piece of lint off his immaculate charcoal suit. "From what I hear, the great Victor Newman isn't quite the titan he used to be. Recovering from a gunshot wound, dealing with that lunatic Jordan. He's vulnerable, Nikki, we both know it." Nikki stiffened. "Victor is stronger than you could ever imagine." "Maybe," Desmond conceded, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "But is he strong enough to handle the truth about what you did in '88? The devastating little con you ran on that oil tycoon? The one that left him destitute and, well, let's just say, permanently silenced." The color drained from Nikki's face, the memory, buried under decades of wealth and respectability, surged back with nauseating clarity. The flashing lights, the desperate need for cash, the plan that had spiraled so horribly out of control. She had thought that part of her life was erased, buried in the desert sands. "What do you want?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her. Desmond smiled, a cold, calculated expression. "I don't want money, Nikki. Cash is fleeting. I want power. I want a seat at the table. Specifically, I want a controlling interest in the Newman Media division, a silent partner, if you will." "That's impossible," Nikki gasped. "Victor would never." "Then you'll make it possible," Desmond cut in, his voice hardening. "Because if you don't, I send the file. I have police reports, witness statements, the whole ugly dossier to the Genoa City Chronicle. And to Victor. Imagine the headlines: matriarch of Newman dynasty. The con artist killer." The following morning, the air at Newman Enterprises felt suffocating. Nikki sat at her desk, staring blankly at the quarterly reports for Newman Media. The numbers blurred before her eyes, replaced by images of Desmond's smirk. She felt trapped, a sensation she hadn't experienced since her days on the pole. She knew she couldn't just hand over a piece of the company. It would raise too many flags. Victoria would ask questions. Nick would investigate, and Victor would see right through her. But the alternative was total destruction. She needed leverage. Nikki grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years, a private investigator based in Nevada. She kept her voice low, her eyes darting to the office door. "I need everything you can find on a man named Desmond Shaw, Vegas ties, gambling debts, anything illegal, and I need it yesterday." She hung up, her heart pounding. She had to be smart. She had to outmaneuver him. She was Nikki Newman, after all. She had survived cults, alcoholism, and Victor's enemies. She could survive a two-bit hustler from her past. Later that afternoon, she arranged a meeting with Desmond at a secluded table in the athletic club, away from the prying eyes of the usual lunch crowd. When he arrived, she slid a manila envelope across the table. It was empty, a bluff. "I know about the laundering operation in Reno, Desmond," she lied, keeping her face an impassive mask. "If you expose me, I expose you. We both go down." Desmond didn't blink. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph, sliding it face up toward her. It wasn't a bluff, it was a picture of her, young and terrified, standing over the body of the mark. The date stamp was clearly visible. "Nice try, darling," Desmond whispered, leaning in close. "But I'm not some amateur you can scare off with a ghost story. I have the negatives. I have the weapon you disposed of. I have everything. You have 24 hours to get me those shares." or I burn your world to the ground." Nikki stared at the photo, her breath hitching in her throat. The bluff had failed. He wasn't just a gambler. He was a shark who had been circling for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The fear that gripped her now was primal, a cold hand squeezing her heart. Desperation drove her to the one place she felt safe when the walls of the ranch were closing in. The Abbott mansion was quiet, a sanctuary of old money and different, softer secrets. Jack Abbott found her in the parlor, staring out at the manicured gardens, her silhouette trembling slightly. "Nikki," Jack's voice was warm, filled with the concern of a man who had loved her for decades. "What is it? You looked like you were about to bolt when I walked in." She turned to him, her eyes rimmed with red. "Jack, I'm in trouble, real trouble." He crossed the room into strides, taking her hands in his. "Is it Victor? Is he?" "No," she shook her head quickly. It's something from before. Before I was a Newman, before I was anyone." She couldn't tell him the whole truth, the shame was too great, but she told him enough. A man from her past, blackmail, a threat to the company. "He wants a piece of Newman, Jack," she choked out. "And if I don't give it to him, he's going to destroy my reputation. He has proof of mistakes I made, terrible mistakes." Jack's brow furrowed, his protective instincts flaring. "Nikki, you can't give in to a blackmailer. It never ends. You give him an inch, he takes the whole company. You have to stand your ground." "I can't," she cried softly. "He has evidence that could send me to prison. Jack, that could humiliate Victor and the children. I can't let that happen. He's been through so much lately. If he finds out I brought this to our doorstep, it might break him." "Victor is tougher than you think," Jack argued gently. "But you need a strategy. You need to stall him. Make him think you're complying while we find his weak spot. Everyone has a weak spot, Nikki, even this Desmond Shaw." "I don't know if I have the time," she whispered. "He gave me an ultimatum." "Then we buy time," Jack said firmly. "I'll help you. We'll figure this out. But you have to promise me you won't sign anything without talking to me first." The drive back to the ranch was a blur of anxiety. When Nikki walked through the heavy oak doors, she tried to compose herself, smoothing her skirt and checking her reflection in the foyer mirror. She looked pale, her eyes haunted. Victor was in the living room, seated in his usual armchair, a tablet in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes narrowing instantly. He knew every nuance of her face, every shift in her mood. "You're late," Victor said, his voice deep and unreadable. "And you look flushed. Where have you been?" "Just running errands, darling," Nikki lied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I stopped by the club." Victor set the tablet down. He didn't buy it. He had sensed a shift in the atmosphere for days, the way she jumped when her phone rang, the way she avoided his gaze, the hushed conversations he caught fragments of. "You seem on edge, Nikki," he observed, standing up and walking slowly toward her. He moved with a slight stiffness, a reminder of his recent brush with death, but his presence was as commanding as ever. "Is there something you want to tell me?" "No, nothing," she said too quickly, turning away to pour a drink she didn't want. "Just the usual stress. The board meeting coming up, the charity gala." "I know you better than anyone," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave. He came up behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. She flinched, her body rigid. "You are hiding something, and I will find out what it is." Nikki closed her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was getting too close. If he dug, he would find Desmond. And if he found Desmond, the violence that would follow would be catastrophic. The text message arrived at midnight. Nikki was sitting up in bed, watching Victor sleep, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence she had known for 40 years. The screen lit up the dark room. "Time is up, Nicole. Meet me at the abandoned warehouse on the docks. 2 a.m. Bring the papers, or the morning edition will be very interesting reading for your husband." Nikki stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her terrified eyes. This was it. The walls had closed in completely. She slipped out of bed, her movements silent and practiced. She dressed in black, her hands shaking as she buttoned her coat. She grabbed the file from her safe, fake transfer documents she had hastily forged, hoping they would be enough to fool him for a day or two. It was a desperate, foolish plan, but she had no other cards to play. As she drove through the fog-slicked streets of Genoa City, the weight of her decision crushed her. She was risking everything: her marriage, her freedom, her life, to bury a ghost that refused to stay dead. She pulled up to the docks, the skeletal structures of the cranes looming overhead like gallows. Desmond's car was already there, idling, the headlights cutting through the mist. He stepped out as she approached, a smug grin plastered on his face. "I knew you'd come," he said, extending a hand. "Smart girl." "Here," Nikki said, thrusting the folder at him. "It's the preliminary transfer. It will take time to finalize, but it gives you access." Desmond opened the folder, scanning the documents under the dim street lamp. He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the metal shipping containers. "You take me for a fool," he sneered, tossing the folder onto the wet pavement. "These are garbage, forgeries. I told you, Nikki, no games." He pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'm sending the email now. To Victor, to the press, to the police." "No," Nikki screamed, lunging for him. He caught her wrist easily, twisting it behind her back. "You had your chance, now you watch it all burn." "Please," she sobbed, the fight leaving her as she slumped against his grip. "I'll do anything, just don't tell him." Desmond leaned into her ear, his breath hot and foul. "It's too late for bargaining, unless," he paused, a cruel idea forming, "unless you're willing to do one more favor for me. A favor that requires that specific set of skills you used to have in Vegas." Nikki froze, the implication hanging heavy and grotesque in the air. Before she could answer, headlights swept across them, blindingly bright. A car screeched to a halt nearby. Desmond spun around, shielding his eyes. Nikki used the distraction to wrench herself free, stumbling back into the shadows. She looked toward the light, her heart stopping. It wasn't the police, it wasn't Jack. The door of the black sedan opened, and a familiar figure stepped out, leaning heavily on a cane, but radiating a fury that made the night air crackle. Victor Newman had followed her, and he did not look weak. He looked like a man ready to go to war. The heavy oak doors of the Newman Ranch main house swung open with a groan that seemed to echo the sudden, oppressive shift in the atmosphere. Outside, the March wind howled across the manicured grounds of Genoa City, but inside, the air was still dead still. Victor Newman sat in his leather armchair, a glass of tequila untouched on the side table, his eyes narrowing as they fixed upon the stranger standing in the center of the room. The man, who had bypassed security with unsettling ease, smoothed the lapels of a coat that looked too expensive to be worn by a mere messenger. He had the dark, brooding intensity of a storm front, and when he spoke, his voice carried a timbre that sent a chill down Nikki Newman's spine as she stood by the fireplace. "You don't know me," the man said, his tone devoid of the usual deference people showed the great Victor Newman. "But you knew my mother, and you certainly know your own blood." Victor stood slowly, his posture rigid, the legendary Newman defense mechanism clicking into place. "I have no patience for riddles. State your business or get out." The man stepped into the light. "I am Julian Vance, and I am the son you left behind to rot." Before Victor could summon security, Julian tossed a thick manila envelope onto the mahogany coffee table. It slid across the polished surface, stopping inches from Victor's hand. The contents were not a demand for a payout or a blackmail letter. They were DNA results, detailed, irrefutable, and damning. Victor scanned the documents, his face a mask of stone, but Nikki saw the flicker of recognition, the momentary falter in his gaze. This was not a con. This was a ghost from a chapter Victor had thought long closed, a chapter written in ink and bad blood. "I don't want your money, Victor," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't want a seat on the board, and I don't want the Newman name. I want to watch you lose everything. I want to dismantle this legacy of yours brick by brick. Just as you dismantled my mother's life." Nikki brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes darting between her husband and this new, terrifying adversary. She had seen enemies come and go: Jack Abbott, Tucker McCall, the countless others who had tried to take the crown, but Julian was different. He didn't have the hunger of a businessman. He had the cold, hollow stare of an executioner. She realized with a jolt of pure terror that this wasn't about corporate takeover. This was a blood feud, and Julian Vance was prepared to burn Genoa City to the ground if it meant Victor Newman burned with it. Downtown, the neon sign of crimson lights buzzed against the twilight, casting a sickly glow over the snow-dusted pavement. Nick Newman sat in a corner booth, his untouched coffee growing cold. His leg throbbed of phantom pain from the accident, or perhaps just the physical manifestation of his craving. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing the small, crinkled plastic bag hidden in the lining. Fentanyl, the word itself felt like a curse. He had convinced himself he could handle it, that it was just for the pain, just to get through the days where the pressure of being a Newman felt like a physical weight crushing his chest. He didn't notice the shadow falling over his table until it was too late. Julian Vance slid into the booth opposite him, a shark entering the water. "Rough night, Nick?" Julian asked, his voice smooth, sympathetic. Nick jerked his hand away from his pocket, his eyes narrowing. "Do I know you?" "Not yet, but we share a mutual interest," Julian lied effortlessly, signaling for a refill Nick didn't want. "I know what it's like to carry the weight of a father's expectations. To feel like no matter what you do, the shadow is always there, waiting to swallow you whole." Nick's defenses were usually higher, but the drugs had dulled his instincts, leaving him raw and exposed. He saw in Julian not a threat, but a mirror, someone who understood the suffocating reality of his life. Julian watched him with predatory patience. He knew Nick was the weak link, the cracked pillar in the Newman temple. All it would take was a gentle push, a supplied dose at the right moment, and Nick would not only destroy himself, but drag the family reputation into the gutter with him. Julian smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm new in town, Julian. Let's just say I'm here to shake things up." At Newman Enterprises, the glass walls of the CEO's office reflected the city's skyline, a kingdom of steel and ambition. Victoria Newman paced the floor, her phone pressed to her ear. She was deep in a conversation she knew she shouldn't be having, plotting a maneuver that would undercut Victor's latest acquisition strategy. She told herself it was for the good of the company, that her father was losing his touch, that she needed to secure her own power base before he inevitably pitted her against Adam again. "I need those shares transferred by morning," she hissed into the receiver. "And make sure my father's internal audit team sees nothing." She ended the call, feeling the rush of adrenaline that came with the game. But in her haste to outmaneuver Victor, she had left a digital backdoor wide open. She didn't see the encrypted file transfer blinking on her secure server, a silent extraction of data that was being funneled directly to a laptop in a hotel suite across town. Julian Vance's suite. Julian sat in the dark, the glow of the screen illuminating his face as he watched the Newman proprietary algorithms flood into his drive. Victoria's ambition was her blind spot. She was so focused on the throne that she didn't realize she was handing the keys to the barbarian at the gate. With this data, Julian wouldn't just hurt the stock price. He could frame the Newmans for insider trading, corporate espionage, and fraud. He could turn the SEC into his personal weapon. "Too easy, Victoria," he murmured, closing the laptop. "You're doing my work for me." Back at the ranch, the silence had stretched into an unbearable tension. Victor stood by the window, looking out into the darkness. Nikki approached him cautiously, placing a hand on his arm. The muscles underneath were coiled tight as steel cables. "Victor," she whispered, "who is he really? Is it true?" Victor didn't turn. "Decades ago. A mistake. I thought I had handled it. I thought." She understood the arrangement. "He hates you, Victor," Nikki said, her voice trembling. "I saw it in his eyes. He doesn't care about the money. He wants to destroy you, and he's going to use the children to do it." Victor turned then, his face a mask of fury and regret. "He will not touch my family." "He already is," Nikki cried. Nick is not himself lately, Victor. You know that, and Victoria is so desperate to prove she's better than you that she's reckless. If this man, this Julian, finds a way in, I will crush him," Victor growled, the old lion roaring to life. "I will bury him so deep he will wish he had never heard the name Newman." But even as he said it, Victor felt a cold pit of dread in his stomach. He had fought corporate raiders, psychopaths, and rivals, but Julian was different. Julian was his own creation, a monster born of Victor's own callousness and neglect. This wasn't just an enemy, it was a reckoning. The following day saw the sky over Genoa city turn a bruised purple, a reflection of the bruising battle unfolding on the ground. Julian moved with the precision of a surgeon. He leaked a story to the Genoa City Chronicle about a mystery Newman heir, sparking a media frenzy that camped outside the ranch gates. He approached Victoria under the guise of a venture capitalist, feeding her intel that was actually poison, designed to make her disastrous financial baits. And then there was Nick. Julian found him again, this time in the alley behind the athletic club, where Nick was leaning against the brick wall, sweating through his shirt despite the cold. Julian didn't offer help, he offered a choice. "It gets heavy, doesn't it?" Julian said, holding out a vial. "The pain, the legacy." "I can make it stop, Nick. I can make it all go away. All you have to do is trust me." Nick looked at the vial, then at Julian. The fog in his brain was thick, but a warning bell chimed somewhere in the distance. "Why?" he rasped. "Why are you helping me?" "Because we're brothers," Julian said softly, dropping the bombshell with calculated cruelty. Nick froze. "What? Victor didn't tell you?" Julian stepped closer, his voice a serpentine hiss. "I'm your brother, Nick, the one he threw away. And look at you, the golden boy, reduced to a junkie in an alley. He did this to us. He breaks everything he touches." The revelation hit Nick harder than the drugs. It shattered his reality, twisting his confusion into a sudden, blinding rage, not at Julian, but at Victor. Julian smiled internally. He had weaponized Nick's addiction and his daddy issues in one stroke. Inside the Newman boardroom, the atmosphere was toxic. Victoria was shouting at the legal team, waving the subpoena that had just arrived. The SEC was investigating the irregularities, the very ones Julian had planted through Victoria's own accounts. Victor sat at the head of the table, silent, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the empty chair where Nick should have been. "Where is Nicholas?" Victor demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. The doors burst open. Nick stood there, disheveled, his eyes wild, with Julian Vance standing calmly a step behind him, like a shadow brought to life. "He's with me," Nick announced, his voice slurring slightly, but filled with venom. "And we have a lot to talk about, Dad." Nikki, who had rushed to the office upon hearing the news of the investigation, gasped. She saw the strings being pulled, the web tightening. Julian met her gaze across the room and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "Check. Get him out of here," Victor ordered security, standing up, "and take this imposter with him." "I'm not going anywhere," Julian said, walking to the table and placing his hands on the leather surface. "And neither is Nick. In fact, Nick just signed over his voting proxy to me. Temporary, of course, while he recovers." Victoria went pale. "Nick, tell me you didn't." Nick looked at his sister, his eyes hollow. "He's the only one who listened, Vic. He's the only one who knows what it's really like." Victor looked at his son, seeing the damage, the betrayal, and the drugs all swirling together. He looked at Julian and saw the pure, unadulterated hate. The empire was under siege, not from the outside, but from the very blood that built it. "You think you have won," Victor said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think because you have manipulated a sick man and a confused woman that you have toppled me." "I'm just getting started," Julian replied. "By the time I'm done, the name Newman will be synonymous with ruin. You took my mother's life, Victor. You took my future, now I'm taking yours." The confrontation hung in the air, a suspended explosion. The family was fractured, Nick compromised and weaponized, Victoria unwittingly complicit and legally exposed, Nikki paralyzed by the fear of the total war she knew was coming. And Victor, the Titan, stood alone against the sins of his past, realizing that this time, he couldn't just write a check or make a deal. He had to fight a war for the soul of his family, against a man who shared his DNA and knew all his weak spots. As the storm outside finally broke, rain lashing against the glass, Julian Vance smiled. The young and the restless were always fighting for tomorrow, but Julian had ensured that for the Newmans, tomorrow might never come. The collapse had begun.